In 1962, a young Green Beret captain named Charlie Beckwith walked through the gates of Bradbury Lines in Hereford, England, and watched 22 SAS regiment operators do something the American military had no answer for. They moved in four-man teams with a precision that made every U.S. Special Operations unit look like it was still rehearsing. Beckwith spent an entire year studying everything the SAS did, how they selected men, how they structured teams, and how they decided who deserved to stay. When he came home to Fort Bragg, he wrote a classified proposal to build an American version. The Pentagon rejected it. They rejected it again and again. For 15 years, Charlie Beckwith carried a stolen blueprint in his briefcase that no one in Washington wanted to read. But if you think this is a story about Delta Force copying the SAS, you have it completely backwards. Delta took 3 specific British methods, stripped each one down to its core principles, and rebuilt them into something the SAS barely recognized when they finally saw it in action. Here is what Delta stole, and here is what Delta did with it. To understand how this happened, you need to know what Beckwith actually observed during that exchange tour. Most accounts of this story focus on the fact that he admired the SAS. That is true, but it misses the real significance. Beckwith did not admire the SAS the way a tourist admires a foreign city. He studied them the way an engineer reverse engineers a competitor's machine. During his attachment to 22 SAS in 1962 and 1963, Beckwith participated in selection alongside British candidates. He trained with operational squadrons conducting live missions during the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo. He sat inside briefing rooms at Hereford and watched the regiment's leadership evaluate candidates using methods that no American unit had ever considered. He took detailed notes on 3 distinct processes: the selection marches that tested endurance and solitary navigation, the 4-man patrol structure that formed the backbone of every SAS operation, and the commander's interview board that served as the final psychological filter before a man earned his sand-colored beret. When Beckwith returned to Fort Bragg in late 1963, he compiled those notes into a document titled A Case for a U.S. Army Special Forces Counter-Terrorist Unit. The paper proposed an American unit built on SAS principles, using British selection methods adapted for American terrain and American operational requirements. The Army's response was functionally a rejection. Special Forces leadership at the time saw no gap in their capabilities and no reason to create a new unit that seemed to duplicate what Green Berets were already doing. Beckwith spent the next 14 years pushing variations of that proposal through every channel available to him, through Vietnam, through a gunshot wound that nearly killed him in the Ia Drang Valley, and through a bureaucracy that had no appetite for what he was selling. Then the world changed. The Munich Olympics massacre in 1972 put state-sponsored terrorism on the front page of every newspaper in the Western world. A string of aircraft hijackings across Europe and the Middle East throughout the mid-1970s demonstrated that no Western nation except Israel and Britain had a credible counter-terrorism force. In 1977, the Joint Chiefs of Staff finally acknowledged that the United States had nothing, no dedicated unit trained and equipped to rescue hostages or neutralize terrorist threats on foreign soil. Colonel Charlie Beckwith got his phone call. Delta Force was activated on November 19, 1977, at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And the very first thing Beckwith did was open that old briefcase and pull out the notes he had carried since Hereford. The first tactic Delta stole from the SAS was the selection march. In Hereford, the SAS calls its definitive selection events the fan dance and the long drag. Candidates carry a 55-pound rucksack across the Brecon Beacons in Wales, navigating between grid reference points with a map, a compass, and absolutely no guidance from the directing staff. No encouragement, no criticism, no indication of whether you are ahead of the time standard or behind it. You move from checkpoint to checkpoint through mountain terrain, and when you arrive at each point, the staff simply records your time and gives you the next grid reference. The SAS designed this system in the 1950s, and for 3 decades it was considered the most effective individual assessment in any military on Earth. The concept behind it is deceptively simple. Strip a soldier of every external support structure, his unit, his chain of command, his teammates, and see if he can still function alone under physical stress in unfamiliar ground. Beckwith saw this and understood immediately that the U.S. Army had nothing comparable. American selection programs at the time were team-oriented and instructor-led. A candidate always knew where he stood because someone was watching him and telling him. The SAS approach was the opposite. Nobody tells you anything. You either navigate to the checkpoint on time or you do not. There is no second chance and there is no feedback. Beckwith took this model wholesale and built Delta's long walk around it. Delta candidates carry rucksacks through the Appalachian mountain terrain surrounding Camp Dawson in West Virginia and Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. The fundamental structure is identical to Hereford. Alone, map, compass, rucksack, checkpoints, silence from the instructors. But Beckwith changed two critical variables. First, the weight. Delta candidates carry rucksacks loaded to 70 pounds, a full 15 pounds heavier than the SAS standard. Second, the terrain. The Appalachian routes were selected specifically for their combination of steep elevation changes and dense forest cover that makes compass navigation significantly harder than open moorland. The time standards are classified, but multiple former operators have confirmed that Delta's windows are tighter than what the SAS demands for comparable distances. The philosophy behind these changes reveals something important about how Beckwith thought. The SAS march is a filter designed to eliminate men who will quit under sustained physical pressure. That is its primary function, and it performs that function brilliantly. Delta's march is also a filter, but it adds a second layer. The extra weight and the tighter time windows are calibrated to degrade cognitive function faster than the British version. Delta does not just want to know if you will keep walking. Delta wants to know if you can still read a topographic map accurately and make sound navigation decisions when your body is telling you that the weight on your back is destroying your knees and your shoulders. Former SAS operators who observed Delta's selection during joint visits in the 1980s noted that the rucksack weights alone would have violated British Army training safety regulations. Beckwith knew that. He pushed the physical parameters deliberately past the SAS threshold because he believed the wars Delta would fight required operators who could function under a level of physical degradation that the 1950s SAS model was never designed to produce. The second tactic Delta borrowed and then transformed was the small team structure. The operational backbone of 22 SAS when Beckwith observed them was the four-man patrol. 4 operators, each carrying a specialized role within the team, moving as a self-contained reconnaissance and sabotage unit capable of operating behind enemy lines for weeks without resupply. This 4-man team concept was arguably the SAS's greatest tactical innovation. It had won campaigns across North Africa in World War II, through the jungles of Malaya in the 1950s, and into the forests of Borneo during the confrontation. The beauty of the 4-man patrol was its balance between capability and concealment. 4 men could carry enough firepower and equipment to execute meaningful missions, while remaining small enough to avoid detection in denied territory. Every SAS operator trained first as a member of a 4-man team before anything else. Beckwith replicated this structure directly in Delta's early years. The first operational training cycles at Fort Bragg were organized around 4-man teams, practicing reconnaissance, ambush, and direct action. But within 5 years, Delta began evolving away from the British model in a direction that no one at Hereford had anticipated. The reason was operational reality. Delta was being built for a fundamentally different mission than the SAS 4-man patrol was designed to serve. The SAS patrol existed to infiltrate enemy territory, gather intelligence, conduct sabotage, and survive long enough to extract. Concealment was the primary survival mechanism. Delta's primary mission set was hostage rescue and close-quarters direct action in urban environments. In a building full of hostages and armed terrorists, concealment at the point of action is irrelevant. What matters is speed, violence of action, and the ability to put accurate fire on every threat in a room within the first 2 seconds of entry. The 4-man patrol is ideal for a jungle ambush. It is not ideal for breaching a fortified room where 6 hostages are sitting next to 4 men with automatic weapons. Delta began restructuring its assault elements into teams of 6 to 8 operators, sometimes larger depending on the target. These expanded teams trained obsessively on room-clearing drills that prioritized overwhelming force at the point of entry. Every additional operator in the breaching stack added another weapon pointed at the fatal funnel of the doorway. The SAS, meanwhile, continued refining its 4-man patrol doctrine through the Falklands War in 1982 and years of counter-terrorism operations in Northern Ireland. Both units were getting better, but they were getting better at different things. By the time SAS and Delta began conducting regular joint training exercises in the late 1980s, The divergence was visible to everyone in the room. SAS teams were optimized to infiltrate and survive in hostile territory with minimal footprint. Delta teams were optimized to breach a target location and eliminate every threat inside it before anyone had time to react. An SAS sergeant who participated in exchange training at Bragg during this period later described watching a Delta assault element clear a shoot house and said it felt like someone had taken the original SAS method and removed every consideration from the equation except putting rounds on target faster than the enemy could respond. If you have been watching War Code, you know we cover the Delta and SAS rivalry from every angle. If you want the full breakdown of what happens when these two units train together face-to-face, and why that training has created real tension at the operator level, we covered it in detail in Why Delta Force Hates Training with the SAS. Link is in the description. The third tactic Delta lifted from the SAS was the Commander's Board. In SAS selection, after a candidate survives the marches, the jungle phase, and the tactical evaluations, he faces a panel of senior regiment officers in a formal interview. This board assesses qualities that cannot be measured on a mountain or a shooting range. Psychological resilience under questioning. The ability to think clearly and articulate reasoning while senior officers challenge every statement, judgment in ambiguous scenarios where there is no textbook answer. The SAS Commander's Board has existed since the early decades of the regiment, and for years it was considered the most important filter in the entire selection process, because a man who could march 50 miles with a heavy pack but collapsed under the pressure of a 10-minute interrogation by experienced operators was not someone the regiment wanted on a 4-man patrol behind enemy lines. Beckwith recognized instantly that this addressed a gap no American Special Operations selection had ever attempted to close. U.S. Army assessment at the time was overwhelmingly physical and skills-based. Nobody sat a candidate in a chair and tried to find out what happened to his decision-making when the stress was mental rather than muscular. Delta's Commander's Board was modeled directly on the SAS original, but Beckwith and the founding cadre added dimensions that went considerably further than Hereford. The Delta Board included scenario-based questioning designed to present candidates with impossible tactical and ethical dilemmas that had no correct answer. The interviewers were specifically trained to escalate psychological pressure throughout the session. They would contradict the candidate's responses, suggest that his previous answers had been evaluated as deficient, and imply that the board had already made its decision and was simply watching him fail in real time. The purpose was not cruelty. The purpose was to simulate the cognitive pressure of command in a situation where nothing is certain, your information is incomplete, and the men questioning your judgment have more experience than you will ever have. Former Delta operator Eric Haney described this experience in his book as being interrogated by men who somehow already knew everything about you and were simply testing whether you would break under the weight of that knowledge. The SAS Board, by contrast, moved in a different direction after the mid-1980s. Following internal reviews of selection practices and broader shifts in British military training philosophy, Hereford scaled back several of the more adversarial elements of the psychological interview. The aggressive contradiction approach that Beckwith had observed during his exchange tour was softened. The board evolved toward a more evaluative model, focused on assessing potential rather than testing breaking points. Delta kept the adversarial framework. Delta intensified it. By the 1990s, the Commander's Board had become the single most feared phase of Delta selection, more dreaded by candidates than the long walk, because on the long walk you at least understood what you were fighting. The terrain, the weight, the clock. On the board, you sat in a room full of men who had been conducting real-world operations for decades, and you did not know what the correct answer was, because in many cases there was no correct answer. The men asking the questions knew that. They wanted to see what you did when you realized it too. This brings the whole story to a single question, and the answer depends on where you stand. If Delta Force built its entire selection and operational framework by studying the SAS, and then pushed every one of those British methods further than Hereford was willing to go, what does that mean for the unit that created the original blueprint? There are two positions, and people who know this world argue about them constantly. The first position says the SAS deserves permanent credit as the originator. The SAS invented the selection march, the small team concept, and the psychological board before any other modern military thought to do it. Delta's improvements are meaningful, but they are iterations on a foundation someone else laid. You do not diminish the architect by acknowledging that the next owner renovated the house. The second position is harder to hear if you respect the SAS tradition, but it carries real weight among people who have operated in both worlds. It says that the SAS stopped evolving its own methods around the time Delta began surpassing them. The Brecon Beacon's march runs essentially the same way it did 40 years ago. The four-man patrol remains the core structure. The commander's board was made less demanding, not more. Meanwhile, Delta has continued pushing all three systems into territory the SAS chose not to enter. If you follow that logic, you arrive at an uncomfortable conclusion. The SAS may have invented the modern Special Operations playbook, but the unit that carries that playbook forward is not the regiment. It is the unit that stole from them, improved on every page, and never stopped revising. That is a claim designed to provoke a response, and it should. There are SAS veterans who would reject it outright and point to operations in Sierra Leone, Baghdad, and Helmand Province, where the regiment performed at a level no other force could match. There are Delta veterans who would say that the techniques